In the depths of Kensington Palace, where ancient stones hold centuries of secrets, a single text message would shake the very foundation of the British royal family. Guard Captain Marcus Whitfield had served the crown for 15 years without question, his loyalty as solid as the palace walls themselves. But on a cold November evening, when shadows danced longer than usual through the royal corridors, everything changed. The message was simple, desperate, and terrifying. SOS, they're taking me downstairs. Charlotte begged them not to. Something is very wrong here. If anything happens to me, look for the red journal in my quarters. The truth must survive. Within hours, Captain Whitfield would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of a forbidden relationship, a crying princess, and a mystery that would threaten to expose the darkest secrets of the monarchy. What happened in those basement chambers? Why did Princess Charlotte risk everything to protect a mere guard? And what was written in that red journal that someone was willing to kill for? This is the true story of how one man's courage and a young princess's desperate plea would uncover a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power, where love, loyalty, and truth collided in the most dangerous game of all, survival within the royal family. Marcus Whitfield had always believed that serving the royal family was the highest honor a man could achieve. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches with shoulders that seemed carved from granite, he possessed the kind of presence that made people feel both protected and slightly intimidated. His dark hair was always perfectly groomed, his uniform pressed to perfection, and his green eyes held the sharp alertness of someone who noticed everything and forgot nothing. The morning of November 15th began like any other in his 15-year career. Marcus woke at 5:30 in his small but comfortable quarters within Kensington Palace, a privilege afforded only to the most trusted members of the Royal Protection Detail. The room was sparse but clean, decorated only with a photograph of his late parents and a small bookshelf filled with military history and poetry collections that few people knew he read. After his morning shower and breakfast in the staff dining hall, Marcus began his daily briefing with Inspector General Harrison, a stern woman in her 50s who had been coordinating royal security for over 2 decades. The briefing room was windowless and sterile, filled with monitors displaying feeds from hundreds of security cameras throughout the palace grounds. Princess Charlotte has requested additional garden time today, Inspector Harrison informed him, scanning through her tablet with practiced efficiency. She'll be accompanied by her tutor for botanical studies from 10 to 11:30. You'll maintain standard perimeter watch. Marcus nodded, making mental notes of the timing and logistics. He had been specifically assigned to Princess Charlotte's security detail 3 months earlier, a promotion that many of his colleagues envied. The 8-year-old princess was known for her curiosity and energy, traits that made protecting her both challenging and rewarding. What Inspector Harrison didn't mention, and what Marcus kept carefully hidden, was the growing bond he had developed with the young princess. It had started innocently enough. Charlotte was naturally friendly and talkative, often asking him questions about his job, his family, and his life outside the palace walls. Unlike many children who might be intimidated by his imposing presence, Charlotte seemed drawn to his quiet strength and genuine kindness. The first time she had fallen and scraped her knee in the garden, Marcus had been the first to reach her. Instead of crying for her nanny, Charlotte had looked up at him with tears in her eyes and asked if he could help her. He had cleaned her wound with the gentleness of a father, applied a colorful bandage from his first aid kit, and told her a funny story about how he once fell into a mud puddle while chasing his sister when he was her age. From that moment, their relationship had evolved into something that Marcus knew was dangerous territory. He wasn't just her guard anymore. He was becoming something closer to an older brother or uncle figure. Charlotte would save interesting leaves or flowers to show him during their garden walks. She would ask his opinion on her drawings and share stories about her lessons and friends. Marcus knew the rules. Royal guards were expected to maintain professional distance at all times. They were protectors, not companions. They were there to shield the royal family from harm, not to form personal attachments. But somehow, Charlotte had slipped past all his professional barriers with the innocent persistence that only children possess. As he prepared for the morning shift, Marcus couldn't shake a strange feeling of unease that had been growing over the past week. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on, just a subtle shift in the atmosphere around the palace. Conversations seemed to stop when he entered rooms. He caught staff members giving him looks that seemed to carry hidden meanings. Even Inspector Harrison had been more formal than usual, though she had always maintained strict professionalism. The feeling intensified as he took his position in the palace gardens. The November air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of freshly baked bread from the palace kitchens. Marcus positioned himself with a clear view of the garden paths, while maintaining the discreet distance that allowed Charlotte to feel she had some freedom while remaining completely under his protection. When Charlotte emerged from the palace at exactly 10 o'clock, accompanied by her tutor, Mrs. Robertson, Marcus immediately noticed something different about her demeanor. The usually energetic princess seemed subdued, walking with less of her characteristic bounce. Her blonde curls caught the morning sunlight, but her blue eyes lacked their usual sparkle. Mrs. Robertson was a woman in her 40s with graying hair, pulled back in a practical bun, and clothes that suggested academic seriousness rather than fashion consciousness. She had been Charlotte's tutor for 2 years, and was known for her expertise in natural sciences and her patience with Charlotte's endless questions. As they began their botanical lesson near the rose garden, Marcus observed from his position by the ornamental fountain. He could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the autumn breeze. Mrs. Robertson was explaining the process of photosynthesis, using the remaining green leaves as examples, but Charlotte seemed distracted. After about 20 minutes, Charlotte looked directly at Marcus and gave him a small wave. This was unusual behavior for her during formal lessons, as she had been taught to maintain focus on her studies. Marcus nodded acknowledgement, but remained in position, though he was now paying closer attention to her body language. Mrs. Robertson didn't seem to notice Charlotte's distraction, continuing her explanation of plant biology with academic enthusiasm. But Marcus could see that Charlotte kept glancing in his direction, and there was something in her expression that made him uncomfortable. It wasn't her usual friendly curiosity. There was something that looked almost like worry. When the lesson ended at 11:30, Mrs. Robertson gathered her materials and prepared to escort Charlotte back to the palace. This was the moment Marcus usually dreaded because it meant the end of his time with Charlotte until the next scheduled outing. But today, instead of her usual cheerful goodbye wave, Charlotte did something that sent alarm bells ringing in Marcus's mind. She walked directly over to him, something she had never done during a formal lesson period. Mrs. Robertson looked surprised, but didn't intervene, perhaps thinking Charlotte wanted to share something she had learned about plants. "Captain Whitfield," Charlotte said in a voice that was trying to sound casual, but carried undertones of anxiety. "I found a very interesting beetle yesterday. Could you help me look for more after lunch?" The request itself wasn't unusual. Charlotte was always collecting interesting natural specimens, but the way she said it, the intensity in her eyes, and the fact that she was gripping her hands together in a way that suggested nervousness made Marcus realize she was trying to communicate something more than simple interest in insects. "Of course, Your Highness," Marcus replied formally, aware that Mrs. Robertson was listening. "If your schedule permits, and your parents approve." Charlotte nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly, and then surprised him further by stepping closer and lowering her voice to almost a whisper. "It's very important, Captain Whitfield. There are things hiding in places where they shouldn't be." Before Marcus could respond or ask for clarification, Mrs. Robertson intervened. "Princess Charlotte, we must return for your mathematics lesson. Captain Whitfield will be available later if your parents approve additional garden time." As they walked away, Charlotte looked back over her shoulder at Marcus with an expression that made his chest tighten with concern. There was something in her eyes that looked like fear, though he couldn't understand what an 8-year-old princess living in one of the most secure locations in the world could possibly be afraid of. Marcus remained in the garden for another hour as scheduled, but his mind was racing. He replayed Charlotte's words and behavior, trying to understand what she might have meant. Things hiding in places where they shouldn't be could refer to insects or small animals, but the way she had said it suggested something more serious. When his shift ended, Marcus returned to the security office to file his routine report. Inspector Harrison was at her desk, reviewing schedules for the following week. The office smelled of coffee and the faint scent of the lavender air freshener that Harrison used to combat the staleness of the windowless room. "Anything unusual to report?" Harrison asked without looking up from her papers. Marcus hesitated. Protocol dictated that he should mention Charlotte's unusual behavior, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the growing sense that he was being watched more carefully than usual, Or maybe it was an instinct to protect Charlotte's privacy until he better understood what was troubling her. "No, ma'am," he replied. "Standard garden lesson. No security concerns." Harrison nodded and made a note in her log. "Marcus," she said, finally, looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I want to remind you about the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries with the family members under your protection." The comment seemed to come from nowhere, and Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Of course, ma'am. Has there been some concern about my conduct?" "No specific concerns," Harrison replied, but her tone suggested there might be non-specific ones. "Just a general reminder that our role is protection, not companionship. The royal family values professionalism above all else." Marcus nodded, feeling like he was being given a warning about something he couldn't quite identify. "Understood, ma'am." As he left the security office, Marcus noticed two other guards having a quiet conversation that stopped abruptly when they saw him. One of them, Sergeant Collins, had been a friend since Marcus's early days at the palace. The other was Thompson, a newer guard who had always seemed ambitious and eager to advance his career. "Evening, Marcus," Collins said with a nod that seemed forced. "Collins, Thompson," Marcus replied, noting that neither man met his eyes directly. Walking to his quarters, Marcus felt the weight of unspoken tensions pressing down on him. The palace, which had been his home and sanctuary for 15 years, suddenly felt different. The familiar corridors seemed darker, and the usual friendly nods from staff members were replaced by quick glances and hurried movements away from him. In his room, Marcus sat on his narrow bed and tried to make sense of what was happening. He pulled out his personal journal, a red leather-bound book he had kept since his first day of service, and began writing down his observations and concerns. If something was wrong, he wanted a record of it. As he wrote, Marcus thought about Charlotte's words and behavior. Whatever was troubling her seemed to be connected to his own growing sense of unease. The coincidence was too strong to ignore. Something was happening in the palace, something that involved both him and the young princess he had sworn to protect. Outside his window, the November evening was settling into darkness. Somewhere in the palace, Charlotte was probably having dinner with her family, perhaps sharing stories about her day and her botanical lesson. Marcus hoped she was safe and happy, but the worried look in her eyes continued to haunt him. He had no way of knowing that this would be his last normal evening in the palace, or that within 24 hours, Charlotte would be pleading for his life while he was being dragged toward the ancient basement chambers that held secrets darker than anything he could have imagined. For now, Marcus closed his journal and prepared for bed, unaware that powerful forces were already in motion around him, and that his growing bond with Princess Charlotte had made him both her protector and her greatest vulnerability. The next morning brought an unusual change to Marcus's routine. Instead of his normal assignment briefing with Inspector Harrison, he was informed by a junior staff member that he was to report directly to the East Gardens at 8 o'clock for an unscheduled security assessment. The message felt strange, but Marcus had learned not to question sudden changes in royal schedules. As he walked through the palace corridors toward the East Gardens, Marcus noticed more of the subtle changes that had been troubling him. Staff members who usually greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact. Conversations seemed to pause as he passed. Even the familiar portraits of past monarchs hanging on the walls seemed to watch him with suspicious eyes. The East Gardens were less formal than the areas where Charlotte usually took her lessons. This section of the palace grounds featured wilder plantings, winding paths, and several outbuildings that housed gardening equipment and maintenance supplies. It was also more isolated, with fewer security cameras and less foot traffic from palace staff. When Marcus arrived at the designated meeting spot near an old stone bridge that crossed a small stream, he found Charlotte waiting for him alone. This was highly irregular. Princess Charlotte was never left unaccompanied in any area of the palace grounds, and she certainly shouldn't have been in the East Gardens without her scheduled escort. She was sitting on a wooden bench, still wearing her nightgown and slippers under a hastily thrown-on coat. Her blonde hair was uncombed, and her face showed signs that she had been crying. When she saw Marcus approaching, she jumped up and ran toward him with an urgency that made his heart race. "Captain Whitfield, I had to see you," she said breathlessly, grabbing his hand with both of hers. "Something terrible is going to happen, and I don't know who else I can trust." Marcus immediately knelt down to Charlotte's eye level, his training kicking in despite the unusual circumstances. Your Highness, you shouldn't be here alone. Where's your security detail? Where are your parents? Charlotte shook her head frantically. I snuck out. I heard them talking last night, after they thought I was asleep. They were in Papa's study, and I was supposed to be in bed, but I got thirsty and went to get water from the kitchen. Who was talking, Charlotte? Marcus asked gently, using her first name without thinking, something he had never done before. Papa and Uncle Edward and that scary man with the gray eyes. They were talking about you, Captain Whitfield. They said you were becoming a problem, and that something needed to be done about it. Marcus felt ice in his veins. Uncle Edward was Prince Edward, Charlotte's father's younger brother, a man known for his political ambitions and his belief that the monarchy needed to modernize and consolidate power. The scary man with gray eyes could be any number of government officials or palace advisors, but the description reminded Marcus uncomfortably of Director Blackwood, the head of internal palace security who operated independently of the regular guard staff. What exactly did they say, Charlotte? Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring despite the fear that was building in his chest. They said you had gotten too close to the family, especially to me. Uncle Edward said it was dangerous for a guard to have personal relationships with family members because it could be used against us. The scary man said there were protocols for dealing with guards who became security risks. Charlotte's voice was getting smaller and more frightened as she continued. Then Papa said maybe they were overreacting, but Uncle Edward got angry. He said they couldn't take chances, especially not now when there were so many people watching the family for any sign of weakness. Marcus's mind was racing, trying to process the implications of what Charlotte was telling him. If members of the royal family and palace security were discussing him as a potential threat, his position was not just in jeopardy, his safety might be as well. The scary man said something about taking you somewhere where you could be properly questioned about your intentions. Uncle Edward said it needed to happen soon, before you could become a bigger problem. Charlotte, Marcus said carefully, did they say anything specific about when or where this might happen? She nodded, tears starting to flow again. Tonight, after the evening meal, when most of the staff have gone to their quarters. The scary man said the basement rooms would be private enough for what they needed to do. Marcus felt his blood turn cold. The basement rooms of Kensington Palace were part of the oldest section of the building, dating back several centuries. They were used primarily for storage and maintenance, but Marcus had heard whispers among the older staff about rooms down there that served other purposes. Rooms where people could be taken for conversations that needed to remain completely private. Charlotte, listen to me very carefully, Marcus said, taking her small hands in his larger ones. I need you to go back to your room right now. Tell no one about this conversation. Act normally for the rest of the day. Can you do that for me? She nodded bravely, though her lip was trembling. But what are you going to do, Captain Whitfield? I don't want them to hurt you. The trust and concern in her voice made Marcus's chest tighten with emotion. This brave little girl was risking herself to warn him, and he knew that if her family discovered her involvement, the consequences for her could be severe. I'm going to be very careful, Marcus promised, and I'm going to make sure that you stay safe too. But, Charlotte, this is very important. You must never tell anyone that you warned me. Do you understand? Your safety depends on it. Charlotte nodded solemnly. I understand. But, Captain Whitfield, there's something else. Last week, I saw the scary man coming out of your room when you weren't there. He was carrying a small bag, and he looked very angry when he saw me in the hallway. This information hit Marcus like a physical blow. If Director Blackwood had been in his quarters without his knowledge, there was no telling what might have been planted there or what personal information might have been gathered. His room could have been searched, his belongings examined, his personal journal read. The thought of his private writings being scrutinized made Marcus feel sick. In his journal, he had written about Charlotte with the affection of someone who genuinely cared about her welfare. He had described her intelligence, her curiosity, her kindness to the palace staff. To someone looking for evidence of inappropriate attachment, those writings could be twisted into something sinister. I have to go now, Charlotte whispered, looking around nervously. If they find out I'm gone, they'll ask questions. Go, Marcus urged. Remember, act normal. Don't let them see that you're worried about anything. As Charlotte hurried back toward the main palace building, Marcus remained by the stone bridge, his mind working frantically to process everything she had told him. The situation was worse than he had imagined. Not only was his position in jeopardy, but Charlotte herself might be in danger if anyone suspected she had warned him. Marcus knew he had several hours before the evening meal and the confrontation that was apparently planned for afterward. He needed to use that time wisely. First, he had to return to his quarters and secure anything that could be used against him. Second, he needed to find a way to document what was happening in case something went wrong. Walking back through the palace corridors, Marcus was hyper-aware of every person he encountered. The friendly nod from Mrs. Patterson in the kitchen seemed genuine, but had she been instructed to observe his behavior? The quick glance from Sergeant Williams might have been simple acknowledgement, or was Williams now part of whatever was being planned? In his quarters, Marcus immediately went to his desk, where he kept his personal journal. The red leather book sat exactly where he had left it, but something felt different. The small piece of thread he always placed between specific pages as a security measure was gone. His journal had definitely been read. Marcus flipped through the pages, reading his own words with new eyes. Entries about Charlotte that had seemed innocent when he wrote them now appeared potentially damaging. Charlotte showed me her drawing of the garden today. Her artistic talent is remarkable for someone her age, and her explanation of what each flower meant to her revealed a depth of emotional intelligence that constantly surprises me. Another entry spoke with Charlotte about her concerns regarding the new governess. She trusts me enough to share her worries, and I find myself genuinely caring about her happiness and well-being beyond my professional duties. To Marcus, these entries reflected the natural human connection that had developed between them. To someone looking for evidence of inappropriate behavior, they could be interpreted as proof of an unhealthy emotional attachment that violated professional boundaries. Marcus quickly gathered the most potentially damaging entries and memorized the key passages, then carefully tore out those pages and burned them in the small fireplace in his room. The smoke filled the space with the acrid smell of burning paper, but it was better than leaving evidence that could be used against both him and Charlotte. Next, Marcus sat down and wrote a detailed account of Charlotte's warning and his own observations about the changed atmosphere in the palace. He wrote quickly but carefully, documenting dates, times, and specific conversations. If something happened to him, this record might be the only way to protect Charlotte from being blamed for his disappearance. As he wrote, Marcus thought about the larger implications of what was happening. If the royal family was willing to deal with a guard who had become too close to them, what did that say about the nature of power within the palace walls? How many other people had simply disappeared when they became inconvenient or problematic? The thought made him remember stories told by older guards about colleagues who had left suddenly, under mysterious circumstances. There was Patterson, who had been assigned to Prince Edward's detail and had vanished overnight after allegedly making inappropriate comments about the prince's political activities. There was Davies, who had been found dead in his quarters after raising concerns about security protocols that he felt put the royal family at risk. At the time, Marcus had accepted the official explanations for these incidents. Patterson had been transferred to a position outside London for personal reasons. Davies had suffered a heart attack brought on by the stress of his duties. Now, Marcus wondered if there had been more to these stories than anyone had been told. As the day progressed, Marcus went through his normal duties while watching for signs of what might come. During the afternoon shift change, he noticed that his usual partner, Collins, had been replaced by Thompson, the ambitious newer guard who had been present during several recent conversations that had stopped when Marcus appeared. "New assignment?" Marcus asked casually. Thompson shrugged. Inspector Harrison thought a change might be good for everyone involved. The response was neutral enough, but Thompson's body language suggested nervousness. His eyes didn't meet Marcus's directly, and he positioned himself in a way that seemed more like surveillance than partnership. During the afternoon, Marcus caught sight of Charlotte in the palace gardens with her afternoon tutor, a different instructor who taught her languages and literature. Even from a distance, Marcus could see that Charlotte was making an effort to appear normal, but her movements seemed stiff, and her usual animated conversation with her tutor was notably subdued. When their eyes met across the garden, Charlotte gave him the slightest nod, so small that anyone else would have missed it entirely. The gesture told Marcus that she was thinking about their conversation and was trying to follow his instructions to act normally. As the day wore on, Marcus became increasingly aware that he was being watched. When he went to the staff dining hall for lunch, conversations at nearby tables seemed to quiet when he sat down. When he walked through the corridors, he noticed the same faces appearing in his peripheral vision more often than seemed coincidental. The most unsettling moment came during the late afternoon, when Marcus encountered Director Blackwood himself in one of the main corridors. Blackwood was a tall, thin man in his 60s with gray eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He wore civilian clothes that somehow managed to look more official than most uniforms. "Captain Whitfield," Blackwood said, stopping directly in Marcus's path. "I trust you're prepared for your evening assignment." Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his expression neutral. "I wasn't aware of any special evening assignment, sir." Blackwood smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, but there is. You'll be briefed after dinner. Something has come up that requires your particular attention." "Of course, sir," Marcus replied, though every instinct was screaming at him to run. "Good," Blackwood said. "I do so appreciate cooperation from guards. It makes everything so much smoother for everyone involved." As Blackwood walked away, Marcus felt like he had just been given his death sentence. The man's casual tone and the veiled threat in his words confirmed everything Charlotte had warned him about. Whatever was planned for after dinner would not be a routine briefing. Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon finalizing his preparations. He sealed his written account of recent events in an envelope and hid it in a location where it might be found if he disappeared. He wrote a brief letter to his sister, telling her that he loved her and that if anything happened to him, she should contact the investigative journalists at the Guardian newspaper. As evening approached and the time for dinner drew near, Marcus stood at the window of his quarters, looking out at the palace gardens where he had spent so many peaceful hours with Charlotte. The November evening was dark and cold, with clouds obscuring the moon and casting everything into deeper shadows than usual. In a few hours, Marcus would be called to that evening assignment. He would be taken to the basement rooms that Charlotte had mentioned, where men with gray eyes would ask him questions about his intentions and his relationship with the young princess he had tried so hard to protect. Marcus touched the pocket where he had placed his mobile phone, already composing the SOS message that might be his last communication with the outside world. In that message, he would tell the truth about Princess Charlotte's desperate attempt to save him, and he would ensure that his loyalty to her was documented even if it cost him everything. The dinner bell rang in the distance, echoing through the stone corridors of Kensington Palace. Soon, the evening meal would be finished, the staff would retire to their quarters, and Marcus Whitfield would learn the true price of caring too much about a lonely little princess who had trusted him with her secrets. 7. The evening meal in the staff dining hall passed like a dream, with Marcus barely tasting the shepherd's pie and vegetables on his plate. Around him, the usual dinner conversations continued normally, but he felt completely disconnected from the familiar rhythm of palace life. Other guards discussed weekend plans, kitchen staff shared gossip about visiting dignitaries, and maintenance workers complained about the old heating system in the North Wing. Marcus tried to participate in the normal social interactions, knowing that any deviation from his usual behavior might raise suspicions. When Sergeant Williams asked about his plans for the upcoming weekend, Marcus managed to respond with something about visiting his sister in Brighton, though the words felt hollow as they left his mouth. "That sounds lovely," Williams replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested he knew Marcus might not be making that trip. After dinner, Marcus returned to his quarters to wait for the inevitable summons. He had changed into civilian clothes, reasoning that if he was going to face whatever was coming, he wanted to do it as Marcus Whitfield the person rather than Marcus Whitfield the Royal Guard. The psychological difference felt important, though he couldn't fully explain why. At exactly 9:30, there was a knock on his door. Marcus opened it to find Thompson standing in the corridor, no longer wearing his guard uniform, but dressed in a dark suit that made him look more like a government agent than palace security. "Time to go." "Marcus," Thompson said simply, "Director Blackwood is waiting for you." "Where exactly are we going?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Just a meeting," Thompson replied. "Nothing to worry about if you've got nothing to hide." As they walked through the palace corridors, Marcus noticed that their route was taking them away from the administrative areas where normal briefings would be held. Instead, they were heading toward the older sections of the palace, where the stone walls were thicker and the modern conveniences like security cameras and intercom systems were less comprehensive. The corridors grew narrower and the lighting dimmer as they descended toward the basement levels. Marcus had been in these areas before during routine security sweeps, but never for a meeting. The air grew cooler and carried the musty smell of age and stone that spoke of centuries of history, much of it dark. Thompson led him down a narrow stone staircase that Marcus had never used before. The steps were worn smooth by hundreds of years of use, and the walls were lined with portraits of long-dead royals whose eyes seemed to follow their descent into the depths of the palace. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a corridor that felt more like a medieval dungeon than part of a modern royal residence. The walls were rough stone, and the only lighting came from a few bare bulbs that cast harsh shadows and left large areas in near darkness. The air was thick and stagnant, carrying scents that Marcus didn't want to identify. Thompson stopped at a heavy wooden door that looked like it had been installed centuries earlier. Iron bands reinforced the wood, and the lock was an old-fashioned key mechanism rather than the modern electronic systems used throughout the rest of the palace. "This is where I leave you," Thompson said, producing a large iron key from his pocket. "Director Blackwood is waiting inside." The door opened with a groan that echoed through the corridor. Beyond it, Marcus could see a stone chamber lit by several oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The room was larger than he had expected, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness above the reach of the lamplight. Director Blackwood stood near the center of the room, no longer wearing his usual civilian clothes. Instead, he was dressed in what looked like formal ceremonial robes, dark fabric embroidered with symbols that Marcus didn't recognize, but that filled him with an inexplicable sense of dread. "Captain Whitfield," Blackwood said as Marcus entered the chamber. "Thank you for joining me. Please take a seat." The only seating in the room was a single wooden chair positioned in the center of the stone floor. It was old and heavy, with thick wooden arms and metal restraints attached to the sides. Marcus realized with growing horror that he was looking at something designed to hold people against their will. "I prefer to stand," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Blackwood smiled that cold smile again. "I'm afraid that's not an option. You see, we have some very important questions to ask you, and we need to ensure that you're comfortable enough to give us honest answers." Two more men emerged from the shadows at the edges of the chamber. Marcus didn't recognize them, but they had the build and bearing of professional security operatives. They moved toward him with the confidence of people who had done this before. "This is unnecessary," Marcus said, backing toward the door only to find that Thompson had locked it from the outside. "If you have questions about my conduct, we can discuss them through proper channels." "Oh, but this is the proper channel," Blackwood replied. "You see, Captain Whitfield, your situation has moved beyond the realm of standard personnel management. Your behavior with Princess Charlotte has become a matter of national security." "My behavior has been entirely professional," Marcus protested, though he knew his words were falling on deaf ears. "Has it?" Blackwood asked, moving closer. "Our investigation suggests otherwise. We've read your personal journal, Captain Whitfield. We've documented your inappropriate emotional attachment to an 8-year-old member of the royal family. We've witnessed your violation of professional boundaries and your attempts to develop a personal relationship with someone you were assigned to protect." Marcus felt trapped between outrage and fear. Everything they were saying was a distortion of the truth, but he could see how his genuine care for Charlotte's well-being could be twisted into something sinister by people who were determined to find wrongdoing. "I have never done anything inappropriate with Princess Charlotte or any member of the royal family," Marcus said firmly. "My conduct has been guided by my duty to protect her, nothing more." "And yet," Blackwood continued, "you've allowed personal feelings to compromise your professional judgment. You've encouraged her dependence on you. You've accepted her trust and affection in ways that serve your own emotional needs rather than her best interests." The words stung because they contained just enough truth to be devastating. Marcus had grown to care about Charlotte beyond his professional duties. He had enjoyed her trust and friendship in ways that probably did violate the strict emotional boundaries expected of royal guards. "Even if that were true," Marcus said, "it hardly constitutes a threat to national security." "Doesn't it?" Blackwood asked. "Consider the implications, Captain Whitfield. A royal guard who has formed an emotional attachment to his charge becomes vulnerable to manipulation. His judgment becomes compromised. His loyalty becomes divided. In the wrong hands, such a person could become a tool for those who wish to harm the royal family." Marcus realized that no matter how he responded to these accusations, Blackwood had already decided his fate. This wasn't an investigation seeking truth. It was a justification for actions that had already been planned. "What do you want from me?" Marcus asked. "Cooperation," Blackwood replied simply. We need you to acknowledge the inappropriate nature of your relationship with Princess Charlotte. We need you to sign a statement admitting that your conduct has compromised your ability to serve the royal family effectively. And we need your assurance that you will never attempt to contact any member of the royal family again. And if I refuse? Blackwood's smile grew wider and colder. Then we'll be forced to explore other options for resolving this situation. Marcus understood the threat implicit in those words. Sign the confession and disappear quietly or disappear permanently. Either way, his career and his life as he knew it were over. I need time to consider your offer, Marcus said, stalling for time while his mind raced through possible options. Time is a luxury we don't have, Blackwood replied. Recent events have accelerated our timeline. Princess Charlotte has been asking questions about security protocols. She's been showing signs of anxiety that suggest she may have been exposed to information she shouldn't have received. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. They suspected that Charlotte had warned him. If they decided she was a security risk, there was no telling what they might do to protect their secrets. Princess Charlotte is 8 years old, Marcus said desperately. She doesn't understand anything about security protocols or palace politics. Whatever anxiety she's showing is probably just normal childhood concerns. Perhaps, Blackwood agreed. But we can't take that chance. You see, Captain Whitfield, your situation affects more than just yourself. The princess has formed an attachment to you that could become problematic if not properly managed. The implications of his words hit Marcus like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to eliminate him as a security risk. They were considering what to do about Charlotte's inconvenient loyalty to someone they had decided was dangerous. You can't hurt her, Marcus said, abandoning any pretense of professional detachment. She's done nothing wrong. She's just a child who trusted the wrong person. Hurt her? Blackwood asked, feigning surprise. Captain Whitfield, we would never harm a member of the royal family. But there are ways to help her forget inappropriate attachments. Medical interventions that can ease the trauma of loss. Therapeutic techniques that can redirect emotional dependencies in healthier directions. Marcus realized with growing horror that they were talking about drugging Charlotte or subjecting her to psychological manipulation to make her forget about him. The thought of that bright, curious, trusting child being subjected to such treatment filled him with rage that overcame his fear. I'll sign whatever you want, Marcus said quickly. I'll confess to anything you say. Just leave Charlotte alone. She doesn't deserve to suffer because I failed to maintain professional boundaries. Blackwood nodded approvingly. Now we're making progress. But you see, Captain Whitfield, your cooperation alone isn't enough. We need to ensure that this situation never repeats itself. We need to understand how you developed such influence over the princess, and we need to identify any other security vulnerabilities in our protection protocols. Marcus realized that signing a confession was just the beginning. They planned to interrogate him extensively, to extract every detail of his interactions with Charlotte, to use his feelings for her as leverage to get whatever information they wanted. As Blackwood gestured for the two security operatives to approach, Marcus understood that he was about to experience the kind of questioning that left permanent marks on both body and mind. The chair with its metal restraints wasn't just for show. It was a tool designed for extracting information from unwilling subjects. In desperation, Marcus reached for his mobile phone, his fingers moving quickly to compose the SOS message he had been mentally preparing all day. If he was going to disappear into the darkness of this underground chamber, he needed to leave some record of what was happening. The text message was brief, but crucial. SOS, they're taking me downstairs. Charlotte begged them not to. Something is very wrong here. If anything happens to me, look for the red journal in my quarters. The truth must survive. Marcus managed to hit send just as one of the security operatives reached him. Strong hands grabbed his arms, and his phone was knocked from his grasp, clattering across the stone floor and disappearing into the shadows. Now, that wasn't very cooperative, Blackwood observed as Marcus was forcibly guided toward the restraint chair. I'm afraid that little message of yours will require us to accelerate our timeline even further. As the restraints closed around his wrists and ankles, Marcus thought about Charlotte sleeping peacefully in her bed somewhere far above this underground nightmare. She had risked everything to warn him, and now both of them were paying the price for caring too much about each other in a world where love and loyalty were seen as security vulnerabilities. The oil lamps flickered in the stagnant air of the chamber, casting dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of secrets and suffering. Marcus closed his eyes and prepared himself for whatever was coming, knowing that his only remaining hope was that someone would receive his message and ask the right questions before it was too late for both him and the brave little princess who had tried so hard to save him. While Marcus was being restrained in the underground chamber, Princess Charlotte lay awake in her bed 3 floors above, staring at the ceiling of her pink and gold bedroom. The ornate moldings and familiar furniture that usually comforted her now seemed ominous in the darkness. Every shadow looked threatening. Every creak of the old palace settling sounded like footsteps approaching her door. Charlotte had tried to follow Captain Whitfield's instructions to act normally throughout the day, but the effort had been exhausting. During her afternoon lessons, she had struggled to concentrate on French vocabulary, while her mind kept returning to the conversation she had overheard in her father's study. During dinner with her family, she had picked at her food while watching her father and Uncle Edward for any signs of what they might be planning. The hardest part had been sitting through her father's bedtime story, a tradition she usually treasured. As he read from her favorite book about a brave knight who protected a magical kingdom, Charlotte couldn't help thinking about Captain Whitfield and wondering if real-life knights ever faced dangers that couldn't be defeated with sword and shield. "You seem distracted tonight, darling," her father had observed, closing the book and studying her face with concern. "Is everything all right?" Charlotte had nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired, Papa. It was a long day of lessons." Her father had kissed her forehead and tucked her blanket around her, the same gentle ritual he had performed every night since she was tiny. "Sweet dreams, Charlotte. Remember that you're safe here, surrounded by people who love you and will always protect you." The words that were meant to comfort her instead filled Charlotte with dread. If her own father was planning to hurt Captain Whitfield, what did safety really mean? And how could she trust anyone to protect her when the people she loved were in danger from her own family? Now, hours later, Charlotte listened to the sounds of the palace settling into its nighttime rhythm. The last of the staff had finished their duties and retired to their quarters. The corridors outside her room were quiet except for the occasional footsteps of guards making their security rounds. Charlotte had been lying still for so long that her muscles ached, but she didn't dare move in case anyone was listening at her door. She had learned from experience that sound carried strangely through the old palace walls, and conversations in one room could sometimes be heard clearly in unexpected places. It was past midnight when Charlotte heard the sound she had been dreading, footsteps in the corridor outside her room, moving with purposeful quiet. The footsteps paused outside her door, and Charlotte held her breath, wondering if someone was going to enter her room to check on her. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the footsteps moved away, heading toward the main staircase that led to the lower levels of the palace. Charlotte waited another 10 minutes, then carefully slipped out of bed and moved to her bedroom door. The corridor was dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast long shadows between the pools of pale illumination. Charlotte could see the figures of 2 men disappearing down the staircase at the far end of the hall. Even from a distance, she recognized one of them as Thompson, the guard who had been watching Captain Whitfield with suspicious eyes. Charlotte's heart began racing as she realized that whatever her father and Uncle Edward had planned was happening right now. Captain Whitfield was somewhere in the palace, probably being taken to those basement rooms that the scary man had mentioned. And she was the only person who knew the truth about what was really happening. For a moment, Charlotte considered going back to bed and pulling the covers over her head, pretending she hadn't seen anything and hoping that somehow everything would work out. But the memory of Captain Whitfield's kindness, his gentle strength, and his genuine care for her welfare made that option impossible. Charlotte had spent 8 years learning to be a princess, which meant understanding duty, responsibility, and the importance of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Captain Whitfield had always protected her, and now it was her turn to try to protect him. Moving as quietly as possible, Charlotte slipped out of her room and began following the route she had seen Thompson and his companion take. The palace corridors that she knew so well during the day seemed completely different in the darkness, filled with shadows and corners where danger might be lurking. As she made her way toward the staircase, Charlotte tried to formulate a plan. She was 8 years old, barely 4 feet tall, and had no power except for her status as a member of the royal family. But Sometimes she had learned being small and unexpected could be an advantage. The staircase leading to the basement levels was one Charlotte had explored before, though she had always been accompanied by adults and had never ventured into the deepest areas. The steps were old and worn, and she had to move carefully to avoid making any noise that might alert the people she was following. As she descended deeper into the palace foundations, the air grew colder and carried strange smells that made her wrinkle her nose. The modern conveniences of the upper floors gave way to bare stone walls and minimal lighting that reminded Charlotte of the medieval dungeons she had seen in history books. When she reached the bottom of the staircase, Charlotte could hear voices coming from somewhere ahead. She followed the sound through a narrow corridor, staying close to the walls where the shadows were deepest. Her heart was pounding so hard she was afraid the sound might give her away. The voices grew louder as she approached a heavy wooden door that stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, Charlotte could see into a stone chamber lit by flickering oil lamps. The scene that met her eyes filled her with horror and rage. Captain Whitfield was strapped to a wooden chair in the center of the room, his face already showing signs of the questioning he had endured. The scary man with gray eyes, Director Blackwood, stood beside him, holding what looked like medical instruments that Charlotte didn't want to think about. "Your cooperation has been most helpful, Captain Whitfield," Blackwood was saying in a voice that sounded pleased and terrible. "But we still need to understand the full extent of your influence over Princess Charlotte. How exactly did you manipulate her emotions to create such dependency?" "I never manipulated her," Captain Whitfield replied, his voice hoarse but still strong. "She's a lonely child who needed someone to listen to her. That's all I ever did." "Come now," Blackwood continued. "An 8-year-old doesn't develop such fierce loyalty to a guard without deliberate cultivation on your part. What techniques did you use? What promises did you make her?" Charlotte felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to them twisting Captain Whitfield's kindness into something ugly and wrong. The man who had bandaged her scraped knee, who had listened to her stories about school friends, who had made her feel safe and valued, was being tortured because he had cared about her. "The princess trusted me because I treated her with respect," Captain Whitfield said. "I never made her any promises except that I would keep her safe. That's what guards are supposed to do." But you failed in that duty, didn't you?" Blackwood asked. "Because your presence in her life has now become a threat to her well-being. Your attachment to her has created a security vulnerability that puts her at risk." Charlotte realized that they were planning to use her love for Captain Whitfield to justify whatever they did to him. They would claim that hurting him was necessary to protect her, that his disappearance was for her own good. The injustice of it filled Charlotte with a fury she had never experienced before. These adults were making decisions about her life and her feelings without even consulting her. They were treating her like a possession to be protected rather than a person with her own thoughts and opinions. Before she could stop herself, Charlotte pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the chamber. The hinges groaned loudly in the stone-walled space, and everyone in the room turned to stare at her in shock. "Princess Charlotte," Blackwood exclaimed, his cold composure cracking for the first time. "What are you doing here? You should be in your room." "Let him go," Charlotte said, her voice shaking but determined. "Captain Whitfield hasn't done anything wrong, and you can't hurt him." Captain Whitfield's face went white with fear, but it wasn't fear for himself. "Charlotte, you shouldn't be here. Go back to your room right now." "I won't go back," Charlotte declared, stepping further into the chamber despite the intimidating presence of Blackwood and his associates. "I heard you talking about Captain Whitfield, and I know what you're planning to do, but you're wrong about everything." Blackwood recovered from his surprise and moved towards Charlotte with what was probably meant to be a reassuring smile. "Princess, you don't understand the situation. Captain Whitfield has been engaging in inappropriate behavior that puts you at risk. We're trying to protect you." "You're lying," Charlotte said with the directness that only children possess. "Captain Whitfield never did anything inappropriate. He was kind to me when other people were too busy. He listened to me when I had problems. He made me feel like my thoughts and feelings mattered." "That's exactly the problem," Blackwood explained, kneeling down to Charlotte's eye level. "Guards aren't supposed to form personal relationships with the people they protect. It compromises their judgment and creates dangerous emotional dependencies." Charlotte stared at Blackwood with the intensity of someone far older than her 8 years. "You mean it's dangerous for me to care about someone who protects me?" You think it's wrong for me to trust someone who has never hurt me or lied to me or made me feel stupid? Princess Charlotte, Blackwood said, his patience clearly wearing thin. These are adult matters that you're too young to understand. I understand that you're hurting someone I care about, Charlotte replied. I understand that you're calling his kindness inappropriate when you're the ones doing inappropriate things. The simple truth of her words seemed to hit everyone in the room like a physical force. Even the security operatives who had been standing quietly in the shadows looked uncomfortable with the situation. Charlotte walked over to Captain Whitfield's chair, ignoring Blackwood's protests. Are you all right, Captain Whitfield? I'm fine, Your Highness, Marcus replied, though his restraints and the evidence of his treatment suggested otherwise. But you need to leave here immediately. This isn't safe for you. Nowhere is safe if they can take away people I care about whenever they want, Charlotte said with wisdom that belonged to someone much older. She turned back to face Blackwood. If you hurt Captain Whitfield, I'll tell everyone what really happened. I'll tell the newspapers, I'll tell Parliament, I'll tell anyone who will listen. Princess, Blackwood said, his voice taking on a harder edge. You're 8 years old. No one will believe you over the official reports of palace security. They'll believe me when I tell them about this room, Charlotte replied. They'll believe me when I describe the chair with the restraints and the medical instruments and the way you talk about protecting me while you torture someone who actually did protect me. Charlotte's words were having a visible effect on Blackwood and his associates. They had planned for resistance from Marcus, but they hadn't anticipated having to deal with an articulate 8-year-old who could expose their methods to public scrutiny. Moreover, Charlotte continued, her voice growing stronger, I'll refuse to cooperate with anything you want me to do. I won't attend public events. I won't pose for photographs. I won't participate in royal duties. I'll tell everyone that my family hurts people who are kind to me. The threat was devastating in its simplicity. Princess Charlotte's public appearances and cooperation were essential parts of the royal family's public image. A princess who refused to smile and wave, who told disturbing stories about palace security, could create a public relations nightmare that would be impossible to contain. You're being very foolish, Princess, Blackwood said, abandoning his attempt at a reassuring tone. Your loyalty to this man is misplaced and dangerous. My loyalty to Captain Whitfield is the best part of who I am, Charlotte replied. If you take that away from me, you'll turn me into someone I don't want to be. The standoff continued for several long minutes, with Charlotte standing protectively near Marcus's chair while Blackwood and his associates tried to figure out how to handle a situation that had spiraled completely out of their control. Finally, Charlotte made one last desperate attempt to save the man who had shown her kindness in a world where such gestures were apparently considered dangerous. Please, she said, her voice breaking as tears began to flow again. Please don't take him away. He's the only person in this whole palace who talks to me like I'm a real person instead of just a princess. He's the only one who remembers that I have thoughts and feelings and fears just like everyone else. The raw emotion in her voice seemed to affect even the hardened security operatives. But Blackwood remained unmoved, his gray eyes as cold as ever. I'm sorry, Princess, he said with finality. But this situation has gone too far to be resolved with sentiment. Captain Whitfield's fate was sealed the moment he allowed personal feelings to compromise his professional duties. Charlotte realized that her pleas weren't going to save Captain Whitfield. These men had made their decision, and nothing she could say would change their minds. But she had accomplished something important. She had witnessed what was happening, and she would remember every detail. As Blackwood gestured for his associates to remove Charlotte from the chamber, she looked directly at Captain Whitfield one last time. I won't forget, she promised. I'll remember everything. And someday, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth about what happened here. It was a promise that would haunt Director Blackwood for the rest of his life, and the beginning of a reckoning that would come sooner than any of them expected. The removal of Princess Charlotte from the underground chamber was accomplished with efficient brutality that would leave no physical marks, but would traumatize her for years to come. 2 security operatives carried her out despite her struggles and protests, while Blackwood assured her that everything would be explained properly in the morning and that she would understand that this was all for her own protection. Charlotte was returned to her bedroom and locked in, with guards posted outside her door to ensure she couldn't leave again. As she lay in her bed, tears streaming down her face, she could hear the sounds of activity in the corridors below. Footsteps, muffled voices, and the occasional metallic clang that suggested equipment was being moved. What Charlotte didn't know was that Marcus Whitfield's SOS message had been received by his sister Emma, a nurse working the night shift at Brighton General Hospital. Emma had always worried about her brother's work at the palace, sensing that there were aspects of royal security that the public never learned about. When she received his cryptic message at 2 in the morning, she immediately knew that something terrible was happening. Emma tried calling Marcus's phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. After an hour of growing panic, she made a decision that would change everything. She contacted Sarah Mitchell, an investigative journalist at The Guardian who had written extensively about government corruption and cover-ups. Sarah had been investigating rumors about the royal family security apparatus for months, following leads that suggested palace protection services operated with less oversight than other government agencies. She had sources who whispered about guards who disappeared suddenly, and staff members who were transferred for asking too many questions. When Emma called her at 3 in the morning with Marcus's message and his instruction to look for a red journal in his quarters, Sarah knew she had stumbled onto something significant. She immediately began making calls to her network of contacts, including a photographer who specialized in documenting government facilities and a lawyer who understood how to navigate the complex legal protections surrounding the royal family. By dawn, Sarah had assembled a small team of investigators and was preparing to make inquiries about Marcus Whitfield's whereabouts. The official response from Palace Security was that Captain Whitfield had been transferred to a position outside London for personal reasons, and that his departure had been routine and voluntary. But Sarah's sources told a different story. Palace staff members were whispering about unusual activity in the basement levels during the night. Kitchen workers reported seeing medical equipment being moved through corridors where it had never been before. Cleaning staff mentioned finding traces of blood in areas that should have been empty. The breakthrough came when Sarah managed to make contact with a maintenance worker who had been assigned to clean the basement chambers early that morning. The man was terrified and reluctant to speak, but he eventually revealed that he had seen evidence of recent occupancy in rooms that were supposed to be used only for storage. There was a chair, he whispered during a clandestine meeting in a London cafe. Old wooden thing with metal restraints, and it looked like it had been used recently. There were medical supplies scattered around, and the whole place smelled like disinfectant, like someone had been trying to clean up something they didn't want found. Sarah knew she needed more evidence before she could publish anything about palace security operations. The royal family's legal protections were extensive, and making accusations without solid proof would result in immediate legal action that could destroy her career. The evidence came from an unexpected source, Princess Charlotte herself. 2 days after Marcus's disappearance, Charlotte managed to slip away from her handlers during a scheduled walk in the palace gardens. Instead of enjoying the autumn air as she was supposed to, she made her way to Marcus's quarters, which had been sealed pending a routine review of his personal effects. Charlotte had watched the guards' routines carefully and knew there was a 20-minute window when that particular corridor would be unmonitored. She used a hairpin she had stolen from her governess to pick the simple lock on Marcus's door, a skill she had learned from reading adventure novels and practicing on jewelry boxes. Inside Marcus's room, Charlotte quickly located the red journal he had mentioned in his message. The leather-bound book contained detailed observations about palace life, security protocols, and, most importantly, his growing concerns about Charlotte's safety and welfare. But, more significantly, the journal contained information about other guards who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, staff members who had been transferred suddenly, and patterns of behavior that suggested a systematic effort to eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to certain members of the royal family's privacy. Charlotte carefully tore out the most important pages and hid them in her coat. She knew that these papers might be the only evidence that could prove what had really happened to Captain Whitfield and possibly help other people who were in similar danger. Getting the evidence to the right people required more courage and cunning than most adults possessed, let alone an 8-year-old girl. But Charlotte had advantages that adults didn't. She was underestimated, she had access to areas of the palace that others couldn't reach, and she had the determination of someone who had witnessed injustice firsthand. During a scheduled public appearance at a children's hospital, Charlotte managed to approach Sarah Mitchell, who was covering the event for The Guardian. While posing for photographs with young patients, Charlotte whispered to Sarah that she had information about Captain Marcus Whitfield and pressed the journal pages into her hand. He was telling the truth about everything. Charlotte said quietly, her words barely audible above the noise of the hospital visit. They hurt him because he was kind to me, and they're planning to do things to make me forget about him. Sarah was stunned by the girl's directness and by the intelligence that shone in her 8-year-old eyes. She quickly pocketed the papers and promised Charlotte that she would investigate everything thoroughly. The journal pages contain enough evidence to support a major investigation into palace security operations. Marcus had documented conversations he had overheard about problem staff members, detailed the suspicious circumstances surrounding other guards' departures, and recorded his growing awareness that certain members of the royal family were more involved in security decisions than the public knew. Most damaging of all, the journal contained Marcus's account of his conversation with Charlotte in the garden, proving that she had tried to warn him and that she had been aware of the threat against him. This evidence contradicted the official story that Marcus had left voluntarily and that his relationship with Princess Charlotte had been entirely professional. Sarah's investigation revealed a pattern of abuse and cover-ups that went back years. Guards who had questioned orders or who had become too close to family members they were protecting had been systematically removed. Some had been transferred to remote positions where they couldn't cause problems. Others had simply disappeared, their fates unknown and uninvestigated. The most shocking discovery was that these operations were being conducted with the knowledge and approval of certain high-ranking members of the royal family who viewed personal loyalty from staff as a security threat rather than an asset. When Sarah's story was published 3 weeks after Marcus's disappearance, it created a media firestorm that the palace couldn't contain or control. The detailed evidence from Marcus's journal, combined with testimonies from other palace staff members who came forward after reading the article, painted a picture of systematic abuse of power within the Royal Protection Services. The public reaction was swift and devastating. Protesters gathered outside palace gates demanding answers about Marcus Whitfield's whereabouts. Members of Parliament called for investigations into palace security operations. International media picked up the story, creating diplomatic pressure that the government couldn't ignore. But the most powerful voice in the growing scandal was Princess Charlotte herself. In a move that shocked the royal family and their advisors, the 8-year-old princess made an unprecedented public statement through her official social media accounts, managed by palace communication staff who were legally required to post her approved messages. Charlotte's statement was simple but devastating. Captain Marcus Whitfield was my friend and protector. He was kind to me when others were too busy, and he treated me like a real person. I saw them take him away, and I know they hurt him because he cared about me. If being kind to a lonely princess is wrong, then I don't understand what being royal is supposed to mean. The statement went viral within hours, generating millions of responses from people around the world who were outraged by the idea that a child's protector had been punished for showing her kindness. The hashtag Justice for Marcus began trending globally, and the pressure for answers became impossible to ignore. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Director Blackwood's operations within palace security. Hidden cameras were discovered in staff quarters, recording devices were found in common areas, and evidence was uncovered of medical experiments designed to alter the memories and emotional responses of people who had been deemed problematic. Most significantly, investigators found evidence that Marcus Whitfield was still alive, being held in a secure facility outside London, where he was undergoing what Blackwood termed rehabilitation therapy, designed to eliminate his emotional attachment to Princess Charlotte. The rescue operation that freed Marcus 3 months after his disappearance was conducted jointly by police and military personnel, acting on direct orders from the Prime Minister. Marcus was found in a heavily sedated state, having been subjected to experimental psychological treatments that had left him with significant memory gaps and emotional trauma. His reunion with Princess Charlotte was carefully managed by child psychologists and took place in a secure hospital environment. Charlotte had spent months in therapy dealing with the trauma of witnessing Marcus's abduction and the guilt she felt for not being able to prevent it. When they finally saw each other again, Charlotte ran to Marcus and threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry I couldn't stop them," she whispered. "I tried to save you, but I wasn't strong enough." Marcus, still recovering from his ordeal, held her gently and replied, "You did save me, Charlotte. Your courage and your refusal to let them hide the truth is what brought me home. You're the bravest person I've ever known." The aftermath of the scandal resulted in a complete overhaul of palace security operations, the resignation of several high-ranking officials, and criminal charges against Director Blackwood and his associates. Marcus was offered financial compensation and a new position with a private security firm that specialized in protecting corporate executives and their families. But perhaps most importantly, the scandal led to new protocols that explicitly protected the right of royal family members to form appropriate personal relationships with their staff and security personnel. The idea that caring about the people you're supposed to protect could be considered a security threat was officially rejected, and new guidelines were established to ensure that kindness and professionalism were not seen as mutually exclusive. Princess Charlotte continued her royal duties with new maturity and awareness of the power she wielded as a public figure. She became an advocate for the rights of people who work in service positions, regularly speaking about the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect regardless of their job titles. Marcus remained in Charlotte's life as a friend and advisor, helping her navigate the complexities of royal life while maintaining the boundaries appropriate to their different roles. Their relationship became a model for how members of the royal family could maintain meaningful connections with the people who serve them without compromising security or propriety. The Red Journal that had started it all was eventually donated to the National Archives, where it serves as a reminder of the importance of speaking truth to power and the courage required to stand up for what is right, even when the stakes are impossibly high. Years later, when Princess Charlotte became an adult and took on more significant royal responsibilities, she would often tell the story of Captain Marcus Whitfield to young people who were struggling to find their voices in difficult situations. She would explain how one man's kindness and one child's refusal to accept injustice had changed the way an entire institution operated. The truth, she would say, is the most powerful weapon against those who abuse their power. But it takes courage to wield it, and it takes persistence to make sure it's heard. Captain Whitfield taught me that protecting people isn't just about physical safety. It's about protecting their dignity, their rights, and their humanity. That's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The scandal that began with a simple SOS message became a turning point not just for the royal family, but for the way society thinks about power, accountability, and the importance of listening to those who are brave enough to speak uncomfortable truths. And at the center of it all was the unbreakable bond between a lonely princess and the guard who showed her that kindness and strength could exist in the same person, and that love, properly expressed and appropriately bounded, was not a weakness to be feared, but a strength to be celebrated.